a most impressive wall behind you that we're never going to get to the bottom of that, are we?
I got a lot of EPs over there.
Yes, you certainly do, among other objects, but it's quite impressive.
Yes, we're not going to get to the bottom of it, but maybe we'll get to the top of it. Well, if we don't get to the bottom or the top of it, I pulled a couple of things that I did want to share with you, given the book and everything, and to talk
Oh,
about.
I love this. Yes,
Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about your brand new book, An Ideal for Living. And it's all about the EP, the extended play
it is.
record. And geez, maybe us two dinosaurs should start this conversation by kind of explaining what the EP truly is and what it means. So why don't we start there? Why don't we start by kind of explaining exactly what an extended play EP is?
Sure. Well, the first of all, thanks, Evan, for having me on the program. Longtime listener, first time caller, as they say. It's great to have the chance to talk about this artifact, as you say. It is I guess what I would call it is sort of a musical Goldilocks, right? Like it's not as long as an LP. It's not as short as a single. It sort of occupies the terrain in between, and um, the reason that I decided to pursue this, I mean, I had written about music for almost 25 years. More than 1,000 bylines, had written for many magazines, newspapers. And what's interesting is I thought about the EP as something that it always brought a certain amount of joy to me to review an EP. You didn't have the pressure on you to have to essay its societal import in the same way that you might an LP, which is really more of like a statement from an artist, and it wasn't as sort of hit and run as a single. And so the extended play has sort of an interesting history. It was basically born out of a form factor war between Columbia Records, which had introduced the LP in 1948, and RCA Victor, which had introduced the single or the 45 RPM record sort of contemporaneously. It was more or less in the same time frame. And RCA's singles at the time were capped at about 4 minutes worth of playing time because of the limitations of the technology and vinyl recording, the lathe cutting. But as the technology improved, you could fit more music onto a 45 size disc, a 7-inch disc.
Right.
And so this is where, RCA Victor seizes on the idea that maybe we can issue more music at a discount. It's sort of like the album at a discount. And in 1952, with their Christmas catalog, they issue what I am guessing is, or what my research suggests is, maybe one of the very first EPs ever, which is a thing called Christmas Party by a family act called the Three Sons. They did this through their Christmas catalog, and I'm reasonably sure that this artifact, which my grandparents owned, which is how I knew about it in the first place, is likely sort of kid A of the EP world. But it was just born out of a battle of the speeds, basically. And, then RCA Victor went on to use its best-selling artist, Elvis Presley, to sell many more of these EPs because it was quite an easy task to sort of bundle up EP on the EP as it would happen.
Right, right. And then of course it changed and sort of and it's as you point out in the book and maybe we'll talk about it a little later, it does still very much exist today
That,
and I like your angle about covering an EP is easier than the full album, but you still get the you can still get the whole review, and I like that from a reviewer's perspective. That's
that's
a clever hack.
well, and it's just true. I mean, I just was thinking back, and when you do research online, I was looking at like the Wikipedia entry for the extended play, and just the history is so sketchy. There just is not much out there, even in the internet world, where you can literally find anything, collect anything, research anything about the EP. And so it just felt natural to me that, like, look, we should explain how this thing came to be. We should talk a little bit about its, fate commercially, why it sort of was always a niche part of the music industry. And to your point, how it managed to survive all the different twists and turns of the music industry over the years, from vinyl to tape to CD to download to stream. The EP, I talked to somebody at Pandora, the streaming company, who told me at one point the EP constituted almost 20% of their total listening catalog. So, which was surprising to me. And so it is as valid or as prevalent today as it's ever been, but it's taken on a very different term. And I suspect, Evan, it's probably because of economic reasons, right? Like it costs so much less for an artist, especially when many artists have digital recording material at home, digital recording equipment that doesn't require them to have to go into a studio to do, a full-blown recording session. It's relatively cheap to sort of bang out 3, 4, 5 tracks, lob it out there, give your audience something fresh, tour behind that, and then knock another one out, right after that.
Right, right. Fresh was the word I was thinking of too. Well, as I said, I grabbed a few things, and we're going to go through some of the entries in your book, and I have some other questions for you. But I just
Sure.
wanted to do a little show and tell, go through the time spectrum in my collection of things. Now, when I think of EPs, and this isn't true, when I think of EPs, I do think about my brain immediately goes to 10 inches,
Yes.
whether that's appropriate or not. I don't know. We can discuss that with my therapist, but I immediately go there. So I grabbed some 10 inches. So I do have some 12 inches too. And as you said, it's interesting to talk about. And I do want to talk about the CD EP, which was so important for me when I was a kid. But
Yes,
but
exactly.
here's Les Paul and Mary Ford. This is a great
Love that.
EP. And I think there were a few of them in this series that had different backgrounds and different colors. And this picture of them has been used so many times in so
It
many
has.
ways.
It
But
has.
but this has a lot of tunes on it. This is almost, you could almost argue that this is just a 10-inch album because it's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's eight songs, which I guess, I don't know, what do we call an album? 9, 10 tracks? Billy Joel had some short
It
records.
depends on the album, right? I mean, you have some albums by the band Yes that are one track for an entire side of a 33 and a third LP. So, four songs as part of a two-record set. So there's a Cab Calloway disc from the 50s. Actually, I think it was recorded in the late 40s. That's included in the book. That's very much, it's assembled very much the way yours is there. That Les Paul EP. It's a 10-inch EP. It plays at 33 and a third, and I think that particular EP has like 8 tracks on it. So you're right. It's confusing to sort of figure out. Does an EP mean 3 tracks, 4 tracks, 8 tracks? Is there a meaningful distinction between that and an album? To your point about the 10-inch, and I write about this in the book, the first EP that I ever bought was by a band from Los Angeles called Oingo Boingo that became famous much later. At that moment in the 1980s, they were literally early 80s. They were just getting started. That
Corey,
was
you just
oh,
blew up my next record. I was going to surprise you with this because I did read the book, and here it is. Here's
uh,
the first EP that you ever bought.
I dearly love that EP from the cover design, which is really the first example of outsider art that I was ever aware of. There wasn't a Google in 1980, so it wasn't possible to sort of look up instantly who that artist would have been and why Danny Elfman, the leader of Oingo Boingo, would have been so would have thought that the music from that disc would have matched with it so well. But what you're holding to me was part of a series from either Epic or CBS. I forget which label it was. Probably both. I think they're related. They're in the family. And that series was a group of mini albums. So in that same time frame, Evan, you would have seen mini albums or EPs from Cheap Trick, from The Clash, from Oingo Boingo that were meant to be sort of this, your favorite artists at a discount. But the
Right.
one you're holding is just a particularly favored item of mine. That's my aunt's birthday present to me from 1980,
Oh,
actually.
thank you. Thank you to your aunt. And yeah, I didn't actually know the story about the cat drawing until I delved into your book a little bit. I didn't realize it was there was such a story behind that one.
Pretty amazing. But yeah, it's cool that you have that though. And again, it's just it's amazing to think that as however old I would have been at that point, 13 years old, that that's the first time that I'm encountering both the EP, that I'm encountering Oingo Boingo, having heard them on was it KMET or KLOS, one of the big LA stations that was playing Only a Lad for like a minute and a half
Right.
there for a moment to sort of introduce them, and also that it really did for me cement in my head, just as it did for you, that 10 inches must, it was something different than a single, something different than a 33 and a third LP. So it must have been 10 inches must be what an EP is. And of course, they're everything. They're all over the place.
Right. And of course, you mentioned the Clash. We've got
There you
a
go.
copy of Black Market Clash here, which also is 6, 7, 8, 9. That's a lot of songs.
That is a bargain for us, Evan, is what that is. And particularly when you look at what is on that record, right? So the stylistic diversity of what the Clash were just starting to get into at that moment. So this EP immediately precedes London Calling. So London Calling would have been the first moment when most Clash fans would have figured out that, like, wow, this punk band that I've loved for the last 2 years also loves 50s rock and roll and rockabilly. They love dub and reggae music, really sort of deep. They love jazz. Who knew that they love jazz?
Right.
So you really start to get a sense through EPs like this one of the stylistic diversity of bands that, up until then, if you'd only heard the first couple of Clash LPs, you would have thought, well, this is a band that plays 2.5 minute punk songs. And they do, but they do a lot more than that.
Right. And of course, the Clash were always they always had a glut of material. So the EP for
Yes.
them was like, let's get this stuff out of here because we want to do another video, another album, and it's going to be a double or a triple. And so the EPs you could see would have been something a very important tool for them.
Well, and do you know who the man is that's on the cover of that record?
No, I don't actually know the story. I always imagined it was some kind of protest. It's some kind of a something going on there
So
because
they very famously wrote the song "Guns of Brixton," and that's
right.
a shot of the Brixton riots. But the man who's facing down the coppers there is Mick Jones's friend Don Letts, who goes on to play with him in Big Audio Dynamite after Jones is kicked out of the Clash.
Oh, that's right. And it's funny. I think I had the opportunity to interview him a long time ago, and it didn't happen. But right, was he's still around? Yeah,
He is still around, and
yeah,
I think was a very formative influence on Joe and Mick at the point where they were discovering, and Paul Simonon too. Would have been discovering this music from urban London that they weren't familiar with, but fitted very nicely with what they were so interested in.
right, right. All right, cool. So this was something I bought a long time ago.
Oh, David Bowie.
This is Bowie, the Manish Boys, Davy Jones in the lower third. Now this is a reissue. This wasn't the original by any means, but I think it was from kind of late 70s, early 80s reissue. But I
Yes.
I remember, I guess it's significant for me because I couldn't, I think I had it for like 5 years before I realized they were talking about David Bowie. This was David Bowie. I was
Isn't
like,
that
what is this?
amazing?
Who is this band? And this is kind of cool. And then I went, oh, this is David Bowie's first band. And they made an EP out of it. Okay, I get it. So,
Yeah.
so again,
David Jones. Davy
appropriate for the
Jones.
story too, appropriate for his story. This was like, hey, David Bowie, and here's some of his old work, and these are his old guys, and it completes the story, I guess, a little bit.
No, that's exactly right. And his record company and him are coming to the conclusion that Davy Jones was a monkey, and that maybe the best thing that he could do is rename himself if he wanted to go on to his own fame and fortune in music. So yeah, I think that disc is actually the point at which the fork in the road opens up for the artist to be known in the future as David Bowie.
Interesting. And again, to bring it back to your book and your thesis, that's kind of what EPs do. They have
Yes,
this transitional moment where again, it's not quite a full album. It's maybe a little bit more, maybe it's close, but it's also where bands can experiment a little bit with who they are and what their sound
exactly.
is. And of course, Britt from Spoon's introduction was great. Calling it a dodge. It's kind of a
Yes.
dodge. It's like the band trying something new, something different.
Isn't Brit's essay was so amazing? I mean, Spoon is a band that's recorded what 7 or 8 EPs on their own, and one thing that Brit points out in that intro is to your point about experimentation. I would say that real Spoon was sort of widely called like almost a Pixies cover band. Their first couple of records, their first major label record, a series of sneaks. I think most reviews sort of compared them to the Pixies. It really wasn't until Soft Effects. So they basically get thrown off their major label. They're sort of casting around for a place to release records. The first thing that I think it's Matador that they sign up with, the
Right.
indie in New York, and the first thing Matador does is says, "Well, the album's not working for you, so try an EP." And I think Brit feels the freedom inherent in an EP to begin experimenting with their sound, and I agree with them. The moment when Spoon sounds like Spoon is on an EP, and it's because Brit felt free to sort of bust loose of stylistic constraints that had sort of governed the band's output prior to that.
Yeah, so interesting. All right, let me just show you a few other things from my collection. Here's a really cool, and I didn't see this in your book, and you probably have seen this. You probably know about this, but this was another really fun pre-internet record for me to discover. This was a Sonic Youth. This is
Oh
the
yeah,
I guess this is, I mean, I guess it's an EP, but it's 100%, which was on, what do you call it?
dirty,
Or
right?
Dirty. And, and this is in orange. But the cool thing about this, and I didn't understand what the word concentric would have meant. Back
Yes,
then, I didn't know what it says here. Strictly limited numbered edition, colored vinyl, concentric groove 10-inch. So it's two songs on the same side,
yes,
which sounds dumb, but for our listeners who don't know what I'm talking about. In other words, depending on where you put the needle on the beginning of the groove, the two songs are running at the same time next to each other, but it
yes.
depends which groove you go into. So that was like some magical stuff with me and my friends going, wait a minute, there's two songs on here.
Totally. That is a very fancy object that you're holding there, produced by Geffen. I think this would have been after Sonic Youth had signed their major label deals. So,
Yep.
something that when they were doing records on Blast First or whoever they were with back in the 80s, nobody would have thought to do something like that. But, here they are, a major label act. They're selling a couple 100,000 LPs per release. And Geffen can afford to put out this magic object. It's cool you have that. I haven't seen many of those in the wild, actually.
Yeah, it's number 8,416. So, and
There you
there's
go.
another zero there. So there are a couple of them out there, I
There's a
think.
few.
Not so limited. No, limited editions are never as limited as we think.
No.
So here's an interesting segue, and you've got Nirvana in your book, but you have the EP. I think there was a blue, some kind of
Yeah.
from '89, but
Yes.
later on now, back to the CDs.
Yes.
We were nuts, and again, this is pre-internet. Okay, we were crazy about Nirvana, and we're like, how do we get more Nirvana, right? So how do we find it? So we would go to the store and buy all of these, go to the singles section, or
Yes.
which in this case really were EPs, and you
Yes.
got all the, and frankly, the music on these discs are sometimes I loved more than the albums proper. And now these did not really come out on vinyl initially. These were all on CD, but
Yeah. This the CD EP. Yes.
some decade ago or whenever this thing came out, they
Yes.
reissued each of them on vinyl. And this is a really fun set to have because again, there are a lot of tracks here that are not on the albums, the regular albums, but and it's cool that they did it. They acknowledged the EP as you are. They're saying, "Hey, these are meant to be." They could have done a double 12-inch or something and gone like, extra extra Nirvana songs, but they said, "No, these sort of should exist as their own individual EPs."
No, that's incredibly cool. And, again, Kurt was a collector, right? I mean, he was somebody who was paying very close attention to the zeitgeist. I think, he was the champion of many independent bands, particularly from the 80s, that, found a second life after Nirvana had championed them. So, the Raincoats, the all female band from the UK, would be one example of this, where the band actually reunited as a result of Kurt championing them. But you do get a sense even in some of the '80s output, and to your point, the EP that we review in the book is called Blue from 1989. It's on a label called Tupelo. A lot of these would have been import objects too.
Right.
And Kurt was, as you point out, like he was a incredibly prolific songwriter. I mean, he had a ton of B-sides that, were out there in the world. They were on the B's of singles, or they found their way into these CD EPs or whatever it is. And I mean, there's some crazy stuff. There's some weird covers in there. I mean, he was a music fan, and I think that the EP gave him a chance to sort of champion acts that you might not know about or otherwise show you just how, ardent a fan he really was.
Yeah, and it's interesting thinking about experimentation. I think a lot of those album covers, the EP covers, he did a lot of the artwork. I think he did for some of the major releases too. But you could imagine that the record label probably wasn't crazy about, hey, I want to do the artwork for this too,
Yeah.
and but probably for the EPs, they were like, Kurt, if you want to do the
Yeah.
EPs, do the EPs.
Yeah, we have designers for that, Kurt, but you do what you want on the EPs. It's fine. Yeah,
Right. So it gave him his visual art outlet there.
that's right.
Segueing from Nirvana into the Breeders, and
Oh,
we kind of hopped over the
Safari.
Pixies, although the Pixies came up. But this is an original. This has been in my collection a long time, and I also had this on CD as a single. I remember, and the Breeders were one of those groups who. Also, at the time, there was nothing coming out. You couldn't go online, you couldn't go on YouTube and find this stuff. So you had to go to record stores, and you would find these EPs, and you would just deal with the three extra songs you could squeeze out of it.
No, that's exactly right. Boy, that's a classic too. That particular disc, Safari, is in we. So aside from having chapters that were devoted to decades, the other thing that the book's format allowed me to do was to compile after we had argued about it. So the book was constructed basically with my history of the EP up front. It almost reads, it's so annotated. It's like the most annotated thing I've written since grad school, but it almost reads like a graduate school paper. And you go from that into decade at a time, starting from the 50s until the present, 25 discs per decade, including a greatest of all time list that's out there, and that we argued over pretty vociferously as a collective. So I crowdsourced the book. Once we decided the format for the book, there was a group of about 150 people on the listserv that kind of self-selected down to about 50 who became the group of people who contributed all the reviews that you read in the book, but also argued over the content of the list, including what constituted the greatest of all time. And certainly Safari is one of those things. It may be the only place where Tanya Donnelly, who was a former Throwing Muses member, and Kim Deal, who was with the Pixies and obviously, kind of co-founded the Breeders with her sister Kelly, are on the same disc at the same time. So that's
Oh,
the other cool thing about what you're holding there. It's amazing material. The song Safari is just so superior to almost everything else that they ever wrote, maybe with the exception of Cannonball. But like, there's unique stuff happening there. You can't find some of these things anywhere else in their catalog, including Tanya Donnelly ever being a Breeders member again.
yeah. And back to the visuals here. I mean, uh, you have the albums and you love them, but I just always love the alternate version of their style. It's
Yes,
got their iconic typography and everything, and it's almost like a whole other album. It's very. I guess what I'm trying to say. It was very exciting as a kid because you loved the look of their records and so here you have a whole other visual thing to feast your eyes on also aside from the music.
100%. And you raised that with Nirvana too. There's so much great art. I mean, going back even to the Oingo Boingo thing, or you talked about the Les Paul and Mary Ford disc, right? Where you have these images that maybe you've seen them before, maybe you haven't seen them before, but it really does give the artist a chance to, if they are so inclined, have a little bit more influence over the visuals that go with their music. And of course, in today's digital world, that's probably less important than it's ever been. It's almost just it's like a little square on your phone. But back in the day, that was a signifier, as you're saying. It was a way to kind of show you as a listener or a consumer, like, you're getting something really different and cool here, and maybe the artist has had more to do with that than they would have under LP circumstances.
I'm glad you brought up also your a little bit more about how the book is designed, how it's organized, so people understand it's a lot of things in one. It's not just starting at A and ending at Z. You do go through the history of the EP, but you do have all these other folks giving input as far as the EPs. But back to sort of the historical thing and thinking of you as a writer, and it's a lot to digest. It was a lot to put together. Could you just walk us through the steps a little bit about how you sort of got that history together, just basically, and kind of kept track of it? And I know you're talking about, the speeds, but is it just something that you picked up because of your love of that format over the years? A lot of these things maybe you just kind of knew, or were there places that you really went, or was your own collection, or how did you kind of really get the nitty gritty together to map out the timeline portion of the book?
It's a great question. I mean, it's really, like I said, it became the most annotated thing I'd written since graduate school. And, just like with a graduate school essay or a thesis, the number of sources, you can see it through all the notations in the back of the book. The sources are all pretty variable, right? So, I mean, there are a number of fairly arcane online sources, things that you find because somebody has digitized their library, and so you're finding these fairly arcane musical histories that are now, through the miracle of Google and search, available to you as a researcher. But some of these things are they're fairly easy to find. So a few go-to websites for me that are just superbly done. Allmusic.com is definitely one of those. It's just an incredible resource as a music fan, as somebody who's sort of looking at history. There's another site called Rate Your Music. And Rate Your Music does two really interesting things. One is that it really becomes it's literally that you can rate the music. So if you're a registered user of the site, you can literally go on, you can write reviews, you can rate the discs on a numeric scale, but it also starts to give you a sense of artist history. And the reason why AllMusic and Rate Your Music are important sources to call out among the dozens that I used. There is some degree of subjectivity that I'm using in what constitutes an EP and what doesn't constitute an EP. And I started to get to a place where if those two sites were routinely calling something an EP as opposed to a single or as opposed to an LP, and then that became a more reliable source, if you will. It was sort of empirical in its way, where you could just see, like, hey, these things on a repeated basis are starting to come up as EPs, because there's a lot of debate about these things. I'll use a specific example. The Specials put out a song called Ghost Town. It was on their very first LP. It's also, I think, their best-selling single ever. Certainly the song that they've become sort of associated with every Halloween. Every station in the world that has a Halloween show plays it.
Yeah, they have the 12-inch with the skeleton playing piano.
Yes.
I don't have it actually, but I don't know what else is on it. But I guess you're about to tell me.
Well, I do have it. I think there's only 3 tracks that are on it. I think it's Ghost Town and 2 non-LP tracks. I could be wrong because I'm not holding it in front of me. But there's a lot of debate in the music community about whether that object is a single or whether it's an EP. And in the case of both AllMusic and Rate Your Music, I think they were pretty definitive in saying this is a single, right? Like it's Ghost Town and some other B-side tracks that are thrown on. And, had it not been that definitive, I think I would have been inclined to include it as an EP on the list because I love that band and I love that song. And Terry Hall, at the time I was writing the book, had just passed. And so they were definitely on my radar as, a very formative part of like Ska 2.0. They were incredibly influential to a lot of other bands that went on in the third wave of ska. They literally sort of rated the Specials catalog and list of influences. But those two resources became really pivotal in guiding the group, right? There's a lot of argumentation happening. Why this disc and not that disc?
Right.
You've got these sort of false equivalencies, like, 25 per decade. What's so important about the number 25? Why don't we include 40 from the 80s? That was clearly the best decade. Well, that also says that maybe you were born at such a time where your first music that you were hearing is like happening in the 80s, so you're emotionally attached to it. So those resources helped give a little bit of the balance that was needed if you were going to have a more diverse collection of music that you could kind of show over the course of 70 years what the EP's development had been. And the last thing I'll say about that is just the best part about the book is that in a way it mirrors the development of the music industry itself. So as the form factors are changing from vinyl to tape to CD to download to stream, you can also see history within each decade playing its role in shaping the music. So the 60s, very tumultuous decade marked by assassinations, sadly. John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. The tumult of the decade is reflected in the music of the decade. And so you get to see hip hop go from this thing that's sort of a curiosity in the 70s, rap battles in the park, to the top of the hit parade within 2 decades. And hopefully the list of items that are reviewed starts to reflect some of the societal changes and stylistic changes that are happening on the hit parade. You see that in the book.
Right. So, really, using that, a lot of those thoughts that you just shared, a lot of those Nirvana, probably people would argue with me about those Nirvana EPs because they're really sort of singles. But I would counter that argument and I would say, well, at the time, we really only got one of those singles at a time. So, for the receiver, you sort of experienced that smaller batch of songs with new songs
Yes.
as its own thing.
Yes.
As weird as that is to sound, but so the debate continues, Corey.
So the debate continues. Indeed, it does. I mean, and that was the beauty of having, the people who were on the list serve were musicians like Britt, a friend of mine who I went to the University of Oregon with, Molly Newman, who played in a band called Bratmobile. They were one of the first Riot Girl acts out of Olympia, Washington, and she reviewed the Bikini Kill EP. She's on the Bikini Kill EP. It is her
Right.
voice that is on that record. There are a ton of amazing music writers, so many that I can't name them, but people like, Annie Zaleski, who are just like, very well recognized and published authors. So I was very lucky to have this sort of crosscut of like musicians, producers, music scene people, writers, all of whom, to your point, very opinionated. I'm sure that there are people who contributed to the book who are like, well, he still got it wrong
Mm.
in parts, which, maybe I did, and maybe is the constitution of part two. Who knows?
Ah, see, it's a segue into another book. Speaking of part two, and one of the fun things about this book is the it really you must have made a decision about how you wanted to include the visuals, and we keep going back to the visual aspect of the EP, but you've got a lot of scans, many of them in color. And I can't imagine that was so easy to get to either. But it's almost like it would have been almost impossible to tell this story without the show and tell factor there.
No, I think, boy, you're definitely raising a good point here, and this is where Todd Novak at Hozac. So Todd is the publisher. He's kind of the founder of that label, because they put out both records and books, and they're really a boutique house. A lot of what they publish are music books, and so very early when Todd and I decided to do the book together, Todd had the incredible brain storm to kind of say, hey, look, this book would be so much more powerful if it had not only the images of each EP, but if it included some collateral from the time at which the EPs were released that showed that these were things that were being, actively promoted from a commercial point of view. And so, yes, there's, every record included. So all 200 of the EPs plus the 13 that, as I said, didn't make the cut, but were still included in the book for consideration. You see a visual image of each of those objects, such as they are, whether they were issued in vinyl or there was only a tape of that thing or a CD EP of that thing, whatever it might have been. And you also see some ads. You see some things that would show you
Right.
that the labels, whether they were, micro labels run by the bands themselves out of their garage or major labels that were, sort of dabbling in the world of EPs, were using to, commercially promote these things at retail back when there was much more music retail than there is today. And it's just fun to see those objects. It's fun to see the way that, the labels were conceiving of, what'll make this rare, weird object, appealing to the buyer.
And also, I like your decision to use some original artwork for the cover rather than just pictures of these things on a table. What's the story with who did the artwork on the front and back of the book? It's
That
really
is
cool.
the incredible Joan LeMay. And so Joan LeMay is somebody who had been known to a number of us in the music industry for some time. And Joan's claim to fame is that she was the, I don't know if co-author is the right way to put it, but she was the co-creator of a book about Steely Dan songs called Quantum Criminals. And So for your listeners, Quantum Criminals is basically a duo effort between Joan and a writer, a significant writer who's sort of dabbling in music, to essay the songs of Steely Dan because they're filled with a bunch of very dark characters. And
Sure.
what Joan does in that book so forcefully is she illustrates each of these songs and the characters behind the songs. And I was besotted with the artwork. I actually bought one of the pieces of art. It's a portrait of Michael McDonald when he was a Steely Dan member,
Oh, cool.
and I was like, God, she would be amazing if I could convince her to do the cover illustrations for the book. And of course, she did the two you showed and a couple of others that we didn't end up using. And I just can't say enough good things about Joan. She's a music fan. She's sort of a part of that firmament, and I think the artwork she did, that original art, really gives the book and its EP subject matter, a unique twist that it wouldn't have had otherwise.
Back to the form factor of the EP being, we could debate what's an EP, what's not an EP, but we can all, I think, agree that it's typically going to be shorter than an album. And I
Yes.
think there's something to be said about brevity in the 21st century here in the year 2024. And it also brings me back to the idea of CDs. And I had a huge CD collection when I was younger, and I loved my CDs and I listened to my CDs. But you could argue, and obviously I love my records probably more. One of the reasons I love my records more is the brevity. CDs were very long, and then there was a push as the longer the CD went on, albums got longer and longer and longer. And you may have liked the album, you may have liked the artist, but there was something about for me at least, where the record would just kind of go on and on and on. And I'd say, oh, okay,
Oh,
I
for sure.
like it, but how much, birthday cake can you have? Which was again why it was fun to have the CD singles, because they were a little bit more bite-sized. Technically you could have put the same amount of music on all those CDs. They were all capable of holding 80 minutes or whatever it was. But the CD just had those four songs or the five songs or something like that. What do you think about our world? We're streaming stuff, or we put the Pandora on, or we put the our artist channel on, wherever we're streaming, and it just goes on and on forever. If we died while we were listening, it would be going on as we
Still
were
going
sitting
on.
there in a chair. And it's funny because I had a brief vacation earlier this summer, and I wanted to listen to my yacht rock. I like to listen to my yacht rock sometimes. And
Of course.
I put the yacht rock on, and I didn't realize it was just going on and on for hours. And at some point I went, we got to turn this off. This has to go.
That's right.
I was
We,
yacht rocked out.
somebody
So
needs to put a stop to this.
turn this thing off. So, how could you kind of respond to that long-winded question about brevity in the 21st century here?
Well, I'll respond to it two ways. One is that in the introduction, in the book's first chapter, I definitely address the point that as technology was evolving, um, possibilities were opening up, and the EP became somewhat confusing during the CD era, right? So if you think about the CD era, I mean, you could store about 80 minutes of material with no sound fidelity issues on a CD. And if you go back and look at the EPs from that era, there's one in particular that I used. It's the Mars Volta had a 2005 release called Francis the Mute, and
Hmm.
presents kind of a conundrum in that, it is a six-track work. So if you were to look at it in a streaming service, you would say, oh, it's six tracks. But on the CDs at the time, contemporaneous with this release, it was cut to five tracks because of formatting constraints. And then the last track, which is a 32-minute track, was
Mm.
actually divided into seven CD tracks for no good reason, really. I mean, there's no logic to the way that works, other than one, which is that it allowed the label to pay Mars Volta for an LP rather than an EP. So their
Uh,
wage fundamentally shifted because of the way that it was constructed. And there are a lot of examples of, CD EPs that go on into like the hour or so range, which for all intents and purposes is an album. And then when you think about proper albums, the Weezer's first record is 30 minutes, basically.
right.
So that is an LP that is half the length of some of the CD EPs. In fact, I think the Circle Jerks' first record, Group Sex, is what, 15 tracks in 16 minutes or something like that. I mean, it's
Hmm.
just absurd. And so you realize that technology is sort of tweaking the dimensions of what you think of as sort of like, what is an EP. Now I'll address the other point you had, although it's not necessarily about yacht rock per se, but it is about an artist's intent. And, when I talked with Britt about writing the intro for the book, um, one of the things I was talking to him about is sort of why do artists even go to an EP? Like, what is the point of having an EP out there? I mean, you could just, back in the CD era, those would have been bonus tracks, right? Or,
Right.
you could sort of tack them on to any other format that you wanted. And what came across to me in so many words that Britt was saying is that it was his intent to put those things together in brief form, to use brevity for its design purpose, to sort of give you, for lack of a better way to put it, kind of a bookmark in the band's recording life. And
Right.
so I've come to kind of cherish this idea of the brevity of the CD being true to the artist's intent at that moment in time. Whether all the reasons you said, it was a stylistic point of difference for the band that kind of marked a fork in the road for them, stylistically or where they might be going. Maybe it was just songs that didn't fit on an album. They still thought they were good songs, so they sort of took a time out and said, like, we're just gonna lob those things out in a different format. Much later in the 2000s, you have bands like Coldplay and Kesha. I would say that even Taylor Swift has done this recently, where they issue EPs as sort of a stocking stuffer that are referential to the album that came before. So
Hmm.
they may have a major release, and then the band comes along later and says, "Look, we're not going to gouge our fans, but like there's 4 songs that didn't make it onto that album, so we'll remix maybe the best track from the album, and we'll stick these other tracks in there as sort of a stocking stuffer that extends the life of the album." And of course, in many cases, that EP will put the main release back into the charts again. So there's certainly, from a record label point of view, like a commercial reason to do it as well.
So cool. Oh man, I love your insight on this stuff, and it's a pleasure to talk to you. As I mentioned, I sort of Safari was on the greatest list, your the big list at the end of the book there, but there are some other big ones too. You talked about the Three Sons, but another really cool one, and these are some that I don't have, so maybe I could, if we're doing a video, I could always find it on the internet. But
Sure.
people may forget that Magical Mystery Tour was an EP. It was originally released. The Beatles released it as an EP in 1967, which is hard to believe that chunk of music came out the same year as Sergeant Pepper.
I
But
know. Unbelievable.
and Magical Mystery Tour is one of my favorite records. Sometimes I would listen to that. I might listen to that, the large version I'm talking about,
Yes,
the
the
extended
LP.
the extended EP.
Yes, the LP. Well, and this shows you kind of the difference in geographies too, right? So the EP that you're referring to, which is sort of it's 7 inches, it's double gatefold, uh, 7 or 8 songs, something like that. These were all included as part of the soundtrack for the somewhat uh, critically failed TV series that the boys put together that ran only on British TV. Um, and what happens with those songs is that for the Beatles, I think they felt from an integrity point of view that they wanted to keep that as sort of an intact item. Just those songs that were only included in the soundtrack by themselves with, 4-color booklet. It looks like a miniature version of the bigger US album you're referring to. Later, the US staples on contemporaneous singles to that. So the one that's the most famous from that is Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever, which is a double A-sided single. That had already come out in both the UK as a single and in the US as a single. But for whatever reason, I think the record company Parlophone decides that UK audiences won't stand for paying for something twice.
Right.
But those Americans, no problem. They'll pay for a single. They'll pay for an album. Later on, they'll replace their entire album collection with CDs, and then they'll do it again when another form factor comes up. So just the difference between the way that American audiences and British audiences were receiving things, which actually economically stands to reason, right? The UK is still going through rationing and other somewhat extreme economic measures in the 60s,
Right.
whereas the US is sailed past all of that in the Eisenhower era, and they're building suburbs and freeways and kids are getting jobs after school. It's a completely different economic condition in the U.S.
I am not a huge Joy Division expert. I don't know much about them, but I do know that the book really was named
It was.
after the Joy Division EP, An Ideal for a Living.
It was. It was the band's first EP when they were actually known as Warsaw. And it actually says that if I had a physical copy of this thing, which by the way would run you thousands of dollars US, it was truly a very limited edition kind of a thing on a micro label. But the 4 tracks that are on there were recorded while the band was still identified as Warsaw. And then much later, after Ian Curtis, the singer for the band, commits suicide before their first US tour, the label comes back and sort of factory from Manchester compiles everything that's Joy Division, including this very early single, and makes those tracks more broadly available commercially. And of course, now you can see and hear some of the distinctions if you go to YouTube, the rabbit hole that is YouTube. I mean,
Right.
it has copies of this. You can hear it in its original format.
Interesting. And of course, and it makes it to the cover, another really important EP for me. And I remember it was on the counter. I can remember the moment when I saw it. It was like on the counter at the record store, and I was buying some other stuff, and the CD was there. And it was Jar of well, actually, if I'm being honest, I think that story is about Sap, which was another Alice in Chains EP.
Came out
And
even before their major
before,
label
right,
debut,
it
if
was
I remember
before.
correctly.
Oh, it
Yeah.
was. It was. Did that? I didn't realize. Did that come out prior to the first
or
Alice in Chains
maybe
album?
or maybe contemporaneous with or just after it. So yeah, and you remember because that was back when the scene would have made for more collaborative kind of work together. And so on that SAP EP, you had contributions from Mark Lanigan from Screaming Trees, you had contributions from Chris Cornell from Soundgarden. I mean, it was you had the Mudhoney guys
Right.
on there as well, so you could really see the scene in a much more collaborative state. And the SAP EP, what's important about Jar of Flies and why it went on the cover is that is the first EP to ever go to #1 in the Billboard album charts.
Oh, I didn't
So
realize that.
yeah, this comes out I think after the band's Dirt album, and it precedes their self-titled release, Alice in Chains, which becomes their first album to go #1. So sequentially, they have Dirt, which sort of puts them into the top tier of touring bands. I think they go on to the Lollapalooza tour shortly thereafter. Then there's Jar of Flies, which goes to #1 in the album charts, and then there's Alice in Chains, which goes to #1 in the album charts. So you can kind of see them using the EP, and I mean the songs on that EP are incredible. They're also created at a point where the band was homeless, so they came back from tour. They came back from Lollapalooza and then their own headline tour, and all the agreements for their apartments and places where they were living in Seattle had effectively sort of like evaporated. And so
Yeah.
the band is living in the recording studio in Seattle, where they're recording that EP for 10 days.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. What a crazy story. Yeah, they were like they became famous and they just never went home again.
No, never went home, never had time to go home. I think they found their stuff boxed up and taken to the curb.
Right, right. And bringing it into the present day, Lana Del Rey's what's the story? The
Oh,
which EP?
Born to
Right,
Die.
right,
Yeah, I mean, contemporaneous with her album Born to Die. And, for me, the thing about Lana that's so interesting is that, she's an artist who I guess routinely gets referred to as sort of like a YouTube artist, that like the way people first discovered her would have been on YouTube, that generation. And this EP is very interesting to me. I mean, again, it comes out contemporaneous with her first album. It basically packages the 4 best songs from that album. And it starts to give you a sense of how hip hop is sort of moving into the broader culture.
right.
So those 4 tracks definitely are, they're all Lana, breathy vocals. They sound like, Sinatra songs from his Capitol era in the 50s. But one of them is produced by Timbaland, who, of course, is Missy Elliott's producer contemporaneously. And you really do start to get a sense that, like, hip hop is no longer a landscape feature or a curiosity. It is a part of the hit charts to the point where even an artist like Lana Del Rey, who's fundamentally not hip hop in any way, is still dipping her feet into the culture. And that becomes the song Ready Born to Die, as well as the song Video Games, I think, is on that same EP. Those are the things that really launch Lana into the pop culture, both on YouTube and even beyond the YouTube culture.
Right. Man, you really know this stuff, Corey.
I don't know about that. Niche interest, as you say.
And
Niche interest.
it's hard to believe it all began with the Oingo, and back we go to Oingo Boingo on
We go
10
to
inch with
Oingo
the
Boingo to my Auntie D, taking me record shopping at Licorice Pizza in Long Beach, California. So before it was a movie, Licorice Pizza was a real record store all over Southern California. And the very first of those was in Long Beach. And yeah, it was sitting in an end cap, and some poor guy was selling it for $2.99. And I was like, what is this?
what is this? And
What is this?
let me write a book about it in 40 years from now. And do you have your collection still? Do you have quite a collection at
I
home?
do. And, look, I think like a lot of people, I had some time on my hands during the pandemic. I mean, it was the first time really in my adult life where I wasn't traveling with my day job. And so two things happened as a result of that. One is that I picked up a shift at a San Francisco radio station. So I was living in the Bay Area at that time, and a friend of mine was DJing for KXSF.FM, which is both on the radio dial and an internet station. And so I picked up a shift every other Thursday, a 3-hour shift. And so my collection sort of bloomed at that point, where I could have done it all digitally, but I just felt like it was more interesting to me to do it old school on
Sure.
two tables with a mixer. And I discovered Discogs. And Discogs is, for people like you and I, I'm looking at the shelf behind you, and it's clear that you've been at this for some time. For people who are into the physical objects, Discogs is the place to locate these things. I mean, it is the most trusted source, I think, for online music purchasing. And certainly I learned a lot just diving in on Discogs and sort of seeing what was an EP. And I certainly discovered some things, some of which are in the book, some of which are super rare, to your point about limited edition. That, really, if a Discogs had not existed, there would have, even with weeks at a time to go record shopping in the places in the world like London and Tokyo and New York that are the most given to physical retail for music, I would have never found even a tenth of what I found.
Well, Corey, I tell you, this has been a really terrific conversation, and I really appreciate your generosity with your time. And thanks for sharing this story of the EP with us.
Evan, thanks for asking me on. And by the way, for your listeners, if you haven't listened to it already, your Andy Summers episode is fantastic.
Oh,
I mean, there are many episodes that are fantastic. That Andy Summers episode, for people of a certain age who were in love with the police and just happened to stumble into the fact that Andy is also a superb photographer,
yeah.
that is an ace episode. Andy is something else. So anyway, keep up the
Well,
good work.
thanks very much. And I wanted to, when I did that episode with him, I really wanted to talk about his photography, because I know, he's talked about his everybody's heard everything he has to say about music and the police and guitar and everything, but I know that the photography looms large in his live shows, and I thought, hey, let's talk about that. I think he appreciated it too.
Well, and I think, for an artist like Andy, who is such a technician, right? I mean, over the years on guitar, I mean, you can argue that some of the tape delay effects and things that he was doing at the time, like nobody else was even remotely thinking of those kinds of things, and that found its way into his guitar playing. That technical capacity to me informs some of the way that he thinks about photography too. So it's fun to join the dots. And when I think about the fact that, I wrote this niche interest book about a thing that very few people have really followed, the way that you can tell stories is actually about what the artist intended, the stories behind the EP themselves, some of the history that we've just spent this time talking about does inform my day job too, in the sense that I do tell stories for clients, or when I was in-house running communications for big companies, I was thinking about how do we tell complicated stories in an emotionally resonant, simple way. And so weirdly, when I was listening to Andy, I was thinking, you know what? This is a guy who has found joy in connecting really disparate things at the center, which is Andy. And I think that that made sense to me. I get that.
Oh, fascinating. Well, again, Corey, I thank you so much again for your time, and can't wait to talk to you next time when you got a new book out.
Thanks, Evan. I appreciate it very much.